She said it loudly enough that the entire open kitchen could hear her. Not a complaint whispered to a companion, not a concern raised quietly to the server, a declaration aimed directly at the woman standing 3 feet away, who had just set the tasting plate down in front of her. "I don't think someone like you really understands what we're looking for here." Adaeze Nwoko had been holding a small ceramic ramekin of house-made cultured butter. She set it down on the table with the particular care of a person who had learned a long time ago that the most powerful response to certain moments was stillness. She didn't correct her, she didn't explain herself. She said, "I'll give you a moment with the menu," and walked back toward the service corridor with the steady pace of someone who had somewhere to be. What Renata Voss did not know, could not have known, because Adaeze had never once told her, was that the woman she had just dismissed as unqualified was the executive chef and sole owner of Chambertin, the only restaurant in Halifax to hold 2 national culinary awards in the same calendar year. That the cultured butter Renata had already eaten half of without noticing had been profiled in a food magazine the previous spring. That the tasting menu Renata was currently scrutinizing for her daughter's rehearsal dinner had been designed by Adaeze personally, over 3 evenings after her sous chef had gone home. But we'll get to that. Adaeze Nwoko was 38 years old, and she had spent most of her professional life being underestimated by people who looked at her and made a decision before she had spoken a word. She was the daughter of a Nigerian-born nurse and a Cape Breton electrician, raised in Dartmouth in a household where Sunday dinner was taken seriously, and food was one of the primary languages spoken between people who loved each other. She had cooked since she could reach the counter. She had staged in kitchens in Montreal, Lyon, and Copenhagen before she was 25. She had returned to Halifax at 31 with a specific vision for what she wanted to build, and the kind of quiet, iron-willed patience required to build it without anyone's permission. Chambertin had opened on a gray Tuesday in November 4 years ago. The room held 42. The menu changed every 6 weeks. The waiting list for a Friday reservation was currently 3 months. Adaeze had designed the space herself. Raw concrete walls, low amber lighting, a long service bar that ran the full length of the kitchen window so guests could watch the team work if they wanted to. Most of them wanted to. She had hired 9 full-time staff and 2 part-time prep cooks, and she ran the kitchen the way her best mentor in Lyon had taught her, with precision, without cruelty, and with the understanding that the food was always the point. She rarely introduced herself as the owner during service, not because she was hiding anything, but because she had learned that people treated her differently when they knew, and she found she could read a table better, understand what they actually needed from the experience, when they hadn't yet decided what category to put her in. Most of the time, tables assumed she was a senior server. Sometimes they assumed she was a manager. Nobody had ever, in 4 years of service, assumed she was the person who had built the restaurant they were sitting in. Renata Voss had booked the private dining room for a rehearsal dinner consultation 6 weeks in advance. The reservation was for 2, herself and her assistant, a composed young man named Felix, who had emailed Adaeze's operations manager 3 times in the 2 weeks leading up to the meeting with increasingly precise questions about dietary restrictions, floral arrangements, and whether the restaurant could accommodate a custom cake from an outside vendor. He had been polite, thorough, a little anxious in the way that assistants become anxious when their employer's expectations are difficult to predict and easy to violate. The wedding itself was Renata's daughter Silvana's. Silvana was marrying a man named Tristan Holt, a structural engineer from Wolfville, and from everything Adaeze's front-of-house manager, a woman named Priya, had gathered during the booking process. The couple was warm, sensible, and largely absent from the planning, which had been absorbed almost entirely by Renata. Renata Voss was 61. She had made her money in real estate development across Atlantic Canada, and she wore it with the particular ease of someone who had never experienced a moment when her financial position was unclear to the people around her. Her coat alone, Priya had noted quietly when Renata arrived, cost more than the restaurant's wine fridge. She had walked into the private dining room already talking, checking her phone while Felix held her coat, scanning the room with the specific expression of a person who was not planning to be impressed. The table had been set with the seasonal tasting arrangement Adaeze had prepared. 4 courses, small portions, each plated with the same care they would receive on the actual event night. Adaeze had introduced herself simply. "Good afternoon, I'm Adaeze. I'll be walking you through this evening's proposal." Renata had looked at her once, then looked back at her phone. The first course went without incident. Renata ate the chilled cucumber velouté with a poached halibut quenelle without commenting, which Felix took as a positive sign and Adaeze took as neutral. The second course was where things changed. Adaeze had set down the lamb tartare with fermented blueberry and house-cured egg yolk, a dish that had been written about in 3 separate publications and that she had spent 4 days perfecting the balance on. And before she had finished placing Felix's portion, Renata said, "The presentation is fine, but I want to talk about the sourcing. Where is this lamb from?" "A farm in Pictou County. We've worked with them for 3 years. I've been to restaurants in Toronto, in Paris, in London," Renata said, not looking at the plate. "I'm used to a certain caliber of sourcing conversation. I want to know if the person I'm speaking with has that frame of reference, or if I should be asking to speak with someone else." Felix looked at the tablecloth. Adaeze looked at Renata for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "I'll let the dish speak for that question while you try it." She set the cultured butter down beside the bread plate and said she would give them a moment. In the kitchen, her sous chef, a young man named Kofi, who had worked with her for 2 years and who had a precise ability to read her mood from the angle of her shoulders, looked up when she came through the pass. "Problem? Not yet." She stood at the prep counter for a moment. From the service window she could see the private dining room. Renata, now eating the tartare with the deliberate slowness of someone trying to find fault with something they had just discovered, was excellent. Felix watching her, the room quiet. Adaeze went back out for the 3rd course. It was at the 3rd course, a pan-seared duck breast over parsnip puree with pickled chanterelles, that Renata made the comment Adaeze had been, without consciously acknowledging it, bracing for since the moment Renata had walked in. She had set the plate down. Renata looked at it. Then she looked at Adaeze with the particular expression of someone about to say something they believe is entirely reasonable. "I want to be honest with you because I think that's more useful than politeness. This is a significant event. 40 guests, many of them from out of province, people with real experience at serious tables. I had my assistant do some research on this restaurant before I booked, and while the reviews are adequate, I'm not certain that the vision here," she gestured vaguely, taking in the room, "Adaeze, the plate, is calibrated to what my daughter's evening actually requires. I don't say that to be unkind. I'm saying it because I think you'd benefit from understanding what the client is actually asking for." The room was very quiet. Felix had stopped pretending to look at the menu. Adaeze stood at the corner of the table and looked at Renata for a long moment without speaking. Not with coldness, not with hurt, with the particular stillness of a woman who had heard versions of this statement so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it and had started instead finding it clarifying. She said, "I appreciate you being direct." A pause. "I'll be right back." She walked through the service corridor to her office at the back of the building. Closed the door, sat down. Her desk held the framed copy of the first review Chambertin had received, the one that had run in a national food magazine 18 months after opening. Under the headline, "The best restaurant in Halifax is one you've probably never heard of." Beside it, a photo of the night they'd received the second award. Adaeze and Kofi and Priya and the rest of the team standing in the kitchen, tired and laughing. She looked at these things for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Priya, whom she asked to pull the Voss booking file and the private dining contract and bring them to the office. The second was to her front-of-house lead, a woman named Ren, who had been with her since the restaurant opened and who answered with the quiet alertness of someone who understood from tone alone when the situation had weight. "I need you to stay close to the private room for the next 30 minutes, Adaeze said. "And if Renata Voss attempts to leave before I come back out, please ask her to wait on the grounds that we have an administrative item to resolve." A pause. "How much trouble?" "Manageable. Just don't let her leave." She spent 12 minutes in the office. Priya brought the file. The private dining contract was 6 pages, and Renata had signed it in full, including Section 8, a clause that had been in Chambertin's private event agreements since the 2nd year of operation, after an incident with a corporate client that Adaeze had never allowed to repeat. The clause covered conduct standards, good faith engagement with the venue and its staff, and included a provision about the restaurant's right to decline to proceed with an event booking if the pre-event consultation process revealed a fundamental misalignment of expectations or conduct that the venue's team found contrary to its operating standards. The language was precise. Adaeze's lawyer had written it. She had read it carefully before signing off on it. She read it again now. Then she straightened her jacket, picked up the folder and went back out. The private dining room was as she had left it. The duck breast plates had been cleared. Felix was looking at his phone with the focused blankness of a man, pretending not to be in an uncomfortable room. Renata was scrolling through something and didn't look up when Adaeze entered. She looked up when Adaeze sat down across from her. This appeared to be unexpected. Adaeze had not sat down once during the entire consultation. She had moved in and out of the room the way servers move, present, efficient, deferential in posture if not in substance. Now she was at the table, folder open in front of her. "I want to revisit something," Adaeze said, "before we discuss the 4th course." Renata's expression shifted. Not into alarm, not yet, but into the particular recalibration of a person who has just realized that the dynamic they assumed was in place is not the one actually operating. I want to make sure we're working from the same understanding of what this consultation is, Adaeze continued. So I want to introduce myself properly, because I don't think I did that adequately when you arrived. She extended her hand across the table. Adaeze Nwoko, I'm the executive chef here. I'm also the owner. I've held both roles since Chambertin opened 4 years ago. Renata looked at the extended hand, looked at Adaeze, did not shake it. The dishes you've been eating today, Adaeze said, keeping her voice at the same steady temperature it had been all afternoon, were designed by me. The tartare you described as adequate for reference is one I spent 4 days on. The sourcing question you raised about the lamb, I can give you the farmer's name, the exact paddock and the processing date if that would help, because I visited the farm twice and I know the operation well. A beat. I raise this not to defend myself. I raise it because the comment you made in the third course suggested that you were uncertain whether this restaurant and its team have the frame of reference required for your daughter's event. I want to make sure that uncertainty is based on the actual work and not on assumptions that might not be accurate. Renata set her phone down on the table. The motion was slow, deliberate. The motion of someone buying time. I wasn't implying. You said you weren't sure the vision here was calibrated to what your daughter's evening requires. Adaeze said. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a citation. You said the reviews were adequate. You asked whether you should speak with someone else. She paused. I want to make sure you have all the relevant information before we decide whether to proceed with the booking. Felix had gone very still. Adaeze opened the folder. Inside 2 printed pages, the Chambertin overview, awards, press, sourcing partnerships. A copy of the private dining contract open to Section 8. The first page is background on the restaurant, in case it's useful context. The second is the contract you signed when you made the booking, open to the clause that addresses how we handle situations where the consultation process reveals a fundamental misalignment. Renata looked at the pages. Then back at Adaeze. Are you threatening to cancel my daughter's rehearsal dinner? I'm giving you information, Adaeze said. What we do with it is a conversation. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not hostile, not quite. The quality of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and both people are deciding what to do with that fact. Renata picked up the first page, she read it. Felix watched her read it, Adaeze waited. The press section included the national award citations, the Globe and Mail feature, the description of Chambertin's culinary philosophy, in the words of the food writer, who had spent 3 services in the kitchen before writing the piece. There was a single quote from that piece at the bottom of the page, set apart from the rest. Nwoko cooks with the kind of precision that doesn't announce itself. You simply realize, halfway through a meal, that everything you've eaten has been perfect. Renata put the page down. She looked at Adaeze for a long moment. And Adaeze saw. Because she had spent her entire career learning to read what happened behind people's eyes. In the moment, they were required to revise a conclusion they had committed to publicly. The specific interior work of a woman who was intelligent enough to understand exactly what had happened, and proud enough that understanding it was its own form of payment. The sourcing conversation, Renata said finally. I was reductive. Adaeze said nothing. The comment I made about the caliber of the team. She stopped. Started again. I was making assumptions that I didn't have a basis for. Yes, Adaeze said. Not unkindly, just accurately. A long pause. Is there a way to continue the consultation? Renata asked. The question came out smaller than anything she'd said all afternoon. Adaeze looked at her for a moment. Then she closed the folder and set it to the side. There is, she said. I'd like to bring the 4th course out. After that, if you'd like to discuss the menu design for Silvana's evening, I'm happy to do that. A pause. But I want to ask you something first. Renata nodded once. My sous chef, Kofi, has been in the kitchen for 3 hours preparing today's tasting. He's 26. He's one of the most technically gifted people I've worked with in 17 years of professional cooking. Before I bring the final course, I'd like you to understand that this meal was his work as much as mine, and that the comment about caliber, he heard it. The kitchen is not as separate from that room as it may appear. A silence. Felix looked at the table. Renata Voss sat with that for a moment. She had the look of a person who had spent decades in rooms where she was the one with the leverage, who was only now and not entirely comfortably, sitting across from someone who had simply decided not to give it to her. I understand, she said. Good. Adaeze stood. I'll bring the dessert course. She walked back through the service corridor. In the kitchen, Kofi was finishing the plating on the final course. A honey panna cotta with compressed pear and a buckwheat tulle that had taken him 3 attempts to perfect that morning. He looked up, read her face. We're okay, he said. We're okay? Give me 2 minutes before you send those out. She stood at the prep counter and looked at the pass. The long steel counter, where every plate that left this kitchen had passed through her hands or his. where every dish that had earned the reviews on that folder page had been checked and approved, and sent out into a dining room full of people who had come here because someone had told them it was worth the trip. Kofi set the panna cotta plates in the pass window. "She actually came around?" he asked. "Somewhat. How much is somewhat?" Adaeze picked up the plates. "Enough." She took the dessert out herself. She set Renata's plate down first, then Felix's. Renata looked at the panna cotta, then at Adaeze. "This is beautiful," she said. "Thank you." Kofi made it. A pause. Would it be possible to tell him that myself?" Adaeze looked at her for a moment. Then she turned toward the service corridor and said, "Kofi." He appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, still in his whites, a little wary. Renata turned to face him. "The tasting today was exceptional. The tartare in particular. I'm sorry for the comment made earlier in the room. It wasn't warranted." Kofi looked at her, looked at Adaeze, looked back. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, the way people mean things when they've been waiting for them without realizing it. After Kofi had gone back to the kitchen, after Felix had pulled out his notebook and the conversation had turned to Silvana's menu and the evening's lipsticks, the flowers, the custom cake, the question of whether 40 guests preferred a family-style final course or individual plating, Adaeze worked through the details with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and found, as she always did, that the work itself was the steady ground under everything else. Renata engaged differently now, still precise, still demanding in the way that people are when they care about something deeply and have the resources to pursue it correctly. But the quality of the conversation had changed. She asked questions instead of delivering verdicts. She listened to the answers. At one point she said, "My daughter is going to love this room." Adaeze said, "It was designed to feel like somewhere you'd want to stay." The consultation ended just after 5 o'clock. Felix gathered his notes. Renata stood and put on her coat and paused at the private dining room doorway with the expression of a person composing something. "For what it's worth," she said, "I came in here today certain I was going to book somewhere else." Adaeze waited. "I wasn't expecting to be wrong." "Most people aren't," Adaeze said. "That's the thing about being wrong." Renata almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that Felix noticed and wrote something in his notebook that was probably not about flowers. After they left, Adaeze stood in the private dining room for a moment. The table was set for 42 on Silvana's evening. The pale linen, the amber light, the kitchen window running the length of the room where anyone who wanted to could watch the team work. She thought about the first line of that national review. "The best restaurant in Halifax is one you've probably never heard of." She had read it standing in this kitchen at 6 in the morning the day it published. Kofi asleep on the couch in the staff room after a closing shift, Priya sending her a screenshot with 3 exclamation marks before she had made it through the first paragraph. It had been a Tuesday, a gray one, the same kind of Tuesday the restaurant had opened on. She turned off the private room lights and went back to the kitchen where the evening prep had already begun, the quiet, serious work of people who had chosen this as their craft and showed up for it every day regardless of who was watching or who had decided, before walking through the door, what they were going to find. Ren passed her in the corridor. "How'd it go?" "We got the booking." "Figured." A pause. "Kofi's been grinning since he went back in there." "Good." The dinner service started at 6. Chambertin filled to its 42 seats, with the smooth efficiency it always did, the room settling into the low-lit particular warmth of a place where people had come knowing something good was waiting for them. Adaeze worked the pass the way she always worked it. Present, focused, sending each plate out with the same attention as the first one of the evening and the last. At some point during service, she thought about something Renata had said. "I wasn't expecting to be wrong." She'd meant it as a concession, as an admission of something, and it was. But it was also, Adaeze thought, a statement about a broader and older problem than one woman in one room on one afternoon. The problem of deciding you already know, of walking into a space and seeing someone and determining, in the space of a second, what they are and what they're capable of, without extending to them the same basic curiosity you would want extended to yourself. She had been on the receiving end of that calculation her entire career, in staging kitchens where she had to prove herself 3 times before she was handed the work she had already demonstrated she could do. In rooms where the assumption was that her presence required explanation, in 100 small moments that had never stopped being small exactly, but had accumulated into something she carried with her, the way you carry anything you've been given without asking for it. She had never made her peace with it. She had simply decided at some point that she would not let it determine what she built. By the time the last table finished and the kitchen had been cleaned, and the floor staff had done their closing checks, it was close to 11. The city outside was the particular quiet of a Halifax Tuesday. The harbor lights visible from the prep kitchen window, the street almost empty, the kind of night that reminded you why people who came from here tended to find it hard to leave for long. Adaeze locked the front door herself. walked the room once in the way she did at the end of every service, chairs, tables, the bar, the kitchen window, making sure everything had returned to the order she had designed this place to hold. She paused at the service window and looked into the empty kitchen. The steel surfaces clean, the equipment dormant, the whole quiet machinery of it waiting for tomorrow. She had built this, with a very specific idea of what it could be, and a willingness to stay in the room long enough for that idea to become real. The people who had looked at her and seen a server, a support role, someone whose presence was functional rather than foundational, they were not the point. They never had been. The work was the point. The sourcing conversation and the cultured butter and the 3 evenings Adaeze had spent designing a menu for a couple she hadn't yet met, and Kofi's 3 attempts at the buckwheat tool. And the particular expression on a guest's face when they realized, somewhere in the middle of a meal, that everything they had eaten had been exactly right. She turned off the last light. Outside she walked to her car, through the cool Halifax night, the harbor somewhere to the east, the city quiet around her. Chambertin had held in 4 years 212 private events. Every one of them had been memorable in its own way. This one, she thought, would be remembered differently. Not for the panna cotta or the blueberry tartare, or the final menu they'd agreed on for Silvana's rehearsal dinner. It would be remembered for what happened in a private dining room on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a woman decided to look at the person across from her and actually see her. Sometimes that was the whole story.